Good morning. I want to say welcome to Lydia Meem, who's a psychologist, a clinical psychologist, and founder of Autism Understanding. Welcome, Lydia. It's lovely to see you. You specialise in helping families recognise the joys and overcome the challenges of autism by tailoring behavioural strategies to suit the needs of our awesome, quirky kids. You must love what you do.
I love it. I really love it.
Excellent. Well, today I want to talk to you a little bit about diagnosis disclosure.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the most important question, the first question is, why is it important to disclose a diagnosis of autism to children?
Oh, I think it's really important because otherwise kids grow up hearing people talking around them and about them but not really understanding what's going on. And so this empowers them to know more about themselves. And I think it's really good for their self-esteem to have that understanding of how their brain works and how they make friends and that kind of stuff. So if they understand themselves better, then that's only going to help. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Lydia, when is the best time to disclose a diagnosis of autism to a child? Or how will you know when they're ready for the discussion?
So I think a lot of people are waiting for their kids to say, tell me everything there is to know about autism. But often that's not the signals that we get. Often we'll get little questions like, how come I didn't get invited to that birthday party? Or why do I have to go to speech therapy? Or, how come I have trouble knowing what to say in conversations? Those kind of questions. And rather than avoiding those questions, they can be an opportunity to start having the conversation around autism. So it doesn't have to be that they're ready for everything there is to know about autism. You can start to have little conversations along the way and get them used to the idea that everybody is good at some things and everybody has trouble with other things, and that's okay. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great advice. Do you think there's a magic age?
No. I think it's probably earlier for kids who are high functioning. So those tend to be the kids who've got lots of questions. And I think the danger is if we leave those really smart, quirky kids too long, they will do their own research. And often they come up with the wrong answers. So they will self-diagnose themselves because Google is an amazing place and you can find all sorts of things. So I've met some teenagers who have thought that they had schizophrenia or bipolar, or who thought they had an intellectual disability because they sometimes lack common sense, but they're very smart. And so they really needed that information as early as we could give it to them, I think. Because otherwise they'll go and find some other answer which without the right support is not helpful. Yeah.
I think we've all done that, haven't we? Lydia, what approach do you find the most productive when disclosing a diagnosis of autism?
So I think it's really important to make sure that kids understand that everybody has things that they're good at and everybody has things that they need help with. So it's not that they're the only one who needs help with stuff. And so I always start by saying things like, when I was at school, I was really good at academic stuff, but I was terrible at music and art and sport. And I'll keep listing things until I find that twinkle in a kid's eye that tells me that they're better at something than me. And because I want them to come from a place of power where they feel like they know more than I do about something. And then I'll talk a lot about the things that they're really good at, and then I'll mention that, they might have trouble knowing what to say in conversations, or sometimes they need to flap a lot, or different things like that. And it's just everybody has things about them. It's not that they're broken. It's not that they're stupid. It's not that they're unwell.
So do you say that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, and I think that's the thing. I think I was thinking about this morning. I think there's perhaps the time to tell kids is when parents are comfortable to be able to have that conversation too. And I don't mean it that, you feel like you know everything there is to know about autism, but you need to not be afraid of saying autism when you're having the conversation, because if if you're afraid of talking about autism, then that's going to come across in the conversation. So you need to be comfortable with having that conversation. And for parents who might be still coming to terms with it themselves, and they might need to talk to a psychologist or an early intervention person or a speech therapist, someone who knows about autism, and to kind of work on that a little bit until they feel comfortable saying those words out loud. And then once they've got that, then to start talking with their kids about it, because I think kids are often looking to us adults for cues on, whether this is something that they should worry about or not. And we need to be able to say this, that having autism is awesome. It's not a terrible thing. And so
use a strengths approach.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so, there are things that you have to work around. There are things that you might need to learn how to do, things that might be outside of, people's comfort zone. And really, that's a human thing. Everybody has to push ourselves sometimes to do things that are not outside our comfort zone, Yeah.
Well, that's a great segue to my next question, is what challenges should a family prepare for when they're disclosing to their child?
Right. Well, I guess that a couple of the things that people tell me that they're worried about is that around the stigma of autism. So often people are worried that if people know about that their child has autism, or if the child knows that they have autism, then people are going to treat them differently. And so I think it's really important that people keep in mind that their child hasn't changed overnight just because they've got a diagnosis. They're still the awesome person that they were before. It's just an extra way of understanding them. And it helps for us to understand how their brain works a bit better, and for us to use strategies that help them to get through the day and to, really focus in on the things that they're strong on and use those things for them to get the most out of life, rather than it, being a negative thing. So I guess parents could talk to the teachers and therapists around them, and I guess let them know that they're thinking about disclosing to their kids, so that everyone in the circle is aware that kids might have questions, because that mum might start having a conversation, and then the child might have questions for dad or for the teacher or for their speech therapist, and say, what's this autism thing? And so if everyone's on the same page, then I think that helps as well. Yeah.
Great. Terrific. Thank you. So for a child, what do you think the advantages are for knowing? I mean, you've touched on it a little bit, but specifically, what's the advantages for disclosing diagnosis?
Well, I think it's really key for kids' self-esteem, because I think they're often very aware that they're struggling. I guess it's different perhaps for some kids who have a really severe intellectual disability, who may not be aware that they're different from others. They may not be as aware of what other people are doing, and so they might just assume that everyone's like them, and that's cool. In which case there's probably not so much urgency around having that discussion around autism. However, I still wouldn't hide it from them. I would still talk about autism like it's just a normal thing in our house. And so that they're familiar with that word, and if they have questions, they can ask. But yeah, for more high functioning kids, I think they're often feeling like they're messing up. They're aware that they're having meltdowns, and they might feel like they're not as good as other kids, or I don't know, they're disappointing their parents, or that they might have some worries about all of that stuff. And I think if kids understand that part of this is to do with the way that their brain's wired, and that it's just the normal way that their brain processes things, and there are things they can do to avoid being overloaded by sensory experiences, for example, that it's not that they're doing it wrong, it's just that that's the way their brain manages those things, then that's going to be a good thing for them. Yeah.
So I guess knowledge is power in that sense.
Yeah, and they can plan ahead. They can
It's understanding yourself, isn't it? I mean, we all feel that.
Yeah, and it's the same conversation that I have with adults on the spectrum. They're often really relieved that they have a better understanding of themselves now and how they do relationships and how they interact with people at work and, how they've made friends through their hobbies and all of that kind of stuff. So it's kind of the same thing, but these kids are just getting a head start on that. Yeah.
Okay. Hard and fast rules. Maybe 3 top tips.
Yeah, I guess I probably wouldn't be reeling off the DSM-5 criteria at them. That's probably not. I wouldn't go jargony. I guess I would just use normal everyday language.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess I would always leave the door open for more questions. So I would always say, here's some information, have a think about it. If you think of anything else you want to ask, I'm happy to answer questions anytime. Yeah. That kind of thing. Yeah.
Okay. And I think the other thing you mentioned was the strength approach.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Yeah. How do you know how much information to give?
I think kids are like adults. They'll tend to glaze if you talk at them too much. And they'll get that look that the lights are on but nobody's home. So if they're still going, oh, cool, is there anyone else in the world that has this? That kind of thing. If they're engaged in the conversation and they've got lots of questions, then you can keep going with it. If they're like, yeah, I've had enough now. You answered my question.
To run away.
Sorry?
They start to run away.
Yeah. Then, that's okay. It's okay. And I don't think that necessarily means that, the conversation was a failure. It just means, that's as much information as I want right now, and then they might come back to you again later. So, yeah.
Okay, so I guess it's tricky if you've got one of, if your child is one of our kids who prefers to play and not be, there's no sort of eye contact or no, face-to-face contact. That's a bit hard to know when they've had enough.
Yeah, that's true. So I guess a lot of the kids that I see tend not to make a lot of eye contact, and so I have a lot of sensory toys on my coffee table, and they'll pick up things to play with, and then I'll pick up something very similar, and the two of us will play with those things together. And so we'll tend to have these conversations in between talking about the sensory toys. So they'll be going, oh, this thing's really cool. Did you see I got to this level or whatever? And I'm like, oh, yeah, that's great. I wonder if it can get down there. And, how are you going with making friends? And so they're sort of giving me these little tidbits of information as we're playing. And that's okay. They don't have to make eye contact. You don't have to make it really hard for them.
That's fabulous advice because it's a natural conversation.
Yeah, I would just sit alongside. If they're not a big person who's into making eye contact, then, it's not a job interview. You don't have to make them face a panel of experts or anything. You can just, cuddle up on the lounge together or be, sort of sitting side by side and have the conversation. And, and if they're interested, they might look up at you but you'll know your kids. They may not be ones that look up a lot, and that's okay. They can be processing even though they look like they're not paying attention. Yeah.
It's a bit like talking to my teenage daughter.
Yeah. When I was a school counsellor, I used to have the sensory toys on the coffee table, and I found they were really good for unfolding those teenagers who came in all hunched up, and then, by the end they would be sitting up straight and looking at me. But in the beginning, they were sort of all curled up. So works with typically developing kids too. Yeah.
So autism affects more than just the child; it's the whole family. So let's talk about siblings. What do we tell the siblings?
Yeah, I think that can be a hard thing. I work with a couple of siblings, and sometimes they're the ones who they can cop it. Sometimes they can be the one who's there when their brother or sister's having a meltdown, or they miss out on something because their brother or sister isn't able to get out of the house, or those kinds of things. But they're often the first person to defend their brother or sister as well if somebody else is saying something nasty about them. So I think it's really good for siblings to have a safe place to talk about times when it's hard, and also things that they really like about their brother or sister. And I think it can be really good for them to link up with other siblings. So for them to know that there are other kids out there who have brothers and sisters with autism, and, whether it's going to the movies or going bowling or things like that, that can be a really nice thing for them to meet other kids who know what it's like.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What do we tell them about the autism diagnosis?
Well, I would sort of give them sort of the same spiel. So I would talk to them about everybody's good at some things and needs help with other things. And they will, the siblings will have things that they're really good at and things that they struggle with.
Yeah.
So like in my family, I have a son who has dyslexia, and his brother's really good at reading. But, my son who has dyslexia, he's really good at skateboarding. And so he'll teach his brother who's not, quite as good at skateboarding, and they teach each other things. And that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're unique.
Yeah.
Okay, so can you give us some tips on what approach we should take with our child's school? Diagnosis disclosure.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm really keen for kids to get the funding that they need. So I think the first thing is to find out what the system is for, who needs to know in terms of applying for funding. It might be that it's just the school counsellor who needs to know, but, on that level, in terms of getting all of the diagnostic information, like sometimes people are a bit nervous about handing out a diagnostic report that has a whole, life history of someone. But I think it's really important for teachers to have access to the strategies. I think it's really important, if families are comfortable to provide the whole diagnostic report. I think that can be really helpful for teachers to understand where that's coming from. But if not, to at least get the part with the recommendations. And I think, to be able to have an ongoing conversation about what's working well, and then, if there's anything that you're working on at home and at school, and to try and see if that can line up. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. In terms of, families, we operate in a community. What would we tell, say, the sports coach if they're playing a team sport in terms of diagnosis disclosure? Do we have to? Should we? Do we do the whole thing? Do we just tell little bits?
I think it's really up to the individual family, but I think it's helpful. I think the way for us to get around this stigma of autism is to start talking about it as part of normal conversations.
Yeah.
And so I think the way, if we talk about it, that this is a normal thing, then it becomes a normal thing. Yeah. And the soccer coaches are looking to parents for cues on how to handle it. So if we talk about it without sounding scared, then there's no reason for the soccer coach to be scared of it either. I think, you can easily have that conversation without mentioning an A word. If parents are worried about a diagnosis slipping out or something like that, or they just want to give their kids a break from having that label or something like that. But I think it might still be really important to talk to the soccer coach about, my son or daughter might have trouble knowing that they're part of a team. They might not automatically know what's going to happen. They have trouble predicting things. And so, we've got some social stories at home. Do you mind if we bring those along? And they might need extra prompts about where they're supposed to be, and, checking out where the lines are on the field and that kind of thing, and remembering I need to stay on this side if I'm a back, or that side if I'm a forward, those kinds of things. And then I guess having that understanding with the coach that there's so much processing involved in something like soccer, of being able to look at who has the ball, and then say you have the ball, knowing who you're supposed to kick it to. Like, there might be somebody who's close, but they might have 5 people around them. You have to look and see that there's someone else who doesn't have very many people around them, even though they're further away. Maybe it's better to kick to them. And if they're running, you don't just kick to where they are, you need to kick to where they're going to run to. And all of that takes extra processing. So for the soccer coach to have that understanding that that's all the work that's going on inside this little person. And so if sometimes they mess it up, that might be part of why. Yeah,
that's lovely. I never thought soccer was that hard, but it is.
Oh, it is. Handball is a mess as well.
I think you've answered, but let me ask you anyway. What have you found is the key to successfully discussing a diagnosis with a child?
Well, I think making sure that it's a positive conversation. So, sometimes I have kids who tell me their diagnosis. They come in and they say, "Oh, I've got Asperger's," and I'm like, "Oh, great! That's really cool." And so that's, I think they're looking to me to see how I'm going to react, and if I don't freak out, then they know that I'm okay. And I think that's really important for parents to keep that in mind, that this is not something that we have to freak out about. I mean, there's a big learning curve, of course, when you first get the diagnosis. There's a lot of stuff to learn, but there's an awesome community of people who are there to help you to understand all the new stuff. And at the end of the day, your child is still the same child. It's just an extra way of understanding them. So for kids, it's an extra way of understanding how they think and how they might interact with people and how they interact with things. But it hasn't really changed them. They were always themselves.
It's lovely. Lydia, who do you think should be involved in the discussion or the diagnosis, the disclosure of autism to a child?
Well, ideally parents and kids. And I think maybe as many parents as possible. Okay. So that everyone's on the same page. But I guess sometimes you get one parent who is more comfortable with the diagnosis than another parent. And so you might be needing to have several of these conversations. And so the person who's most comfortable might do more of the talking than the other parent who's still coming to terms with it. And you might even practice on each other before you start having the conversation with your child, so that you can kind of get your story straight. But I think I'm not a big fan of having secrets. I've always talked to my kids about whatever's going on. Like, we've certainly done speech therapy and occupational therapy and lots of, at the moment we do maths tutoring and English tutoring and other things, and they know why. They know why they're doing all of that stuff. So I think that's important for them to know that, and for them to even be able to be part of choosing to do that. Yeah,
great. So I guess you touched on a little bit then, but what's the best way to prepare for a diagnosis disclosure discussion?
Chocolate.
Well, I would say wine, but yeah.
I think it comes down to your own headspace. So I think, before you can share the diagnosis as a good thing, you need to be able to see those positives about the autism diagnosis. And I think for a lot of parents, they have a lot of fears around autism. So around, is my child going to get married? Are they going to be able to drive? Are they going to have a job? All of that kind of. So what's going to, what kind of high school are they going to go to? And they might only be 2.5 when they start having these worries, And so we don't know any of those things. We don't know the answers to those questions. I don't think most parents of 2.5-year-olds know the answers to those questions either. So I think that's pretty normal to be wondering about those things. We don't have to have all of the answers yet, but I guess we can know that we're going to focus in on kids' strengths like we would with any child. You're going to go with the things that they're good at and the things that they enjoy doing, and there will be something that comes up for them, and it'll be okay. Yeah.
Well, if it's not, what do we do if the child rejects the diagnosis?
So maybe they're not ready yet for that diagnosis, and that's okay. So you can say to them, look, if you don't want to talk about it, that's fine. And you can say to them, you don't have to tell your friends. We don't have to put a sign on the front of the house or, write it in the sky or anything like that. That's okay. You can say that, you might need to talk to their teacher or someone so that they can get the help they need at school. But if you don't want to talk about it right now, that's okay. And if you change your mind, I'm here. I'm happy to have the conversation later if that's what you want to do. Because, a lot of people, most humans, take a while to understand and assimilate information. So, sometimes the first time we hear something, we're like, oh, I'm not sure if that fits for me. It's a bit of a shock. And so you might need to go away and think about it and then go, oh, actually, that does kind of make sense, and then come back. So I think it doesn't necessarily mean that it was a terrible conversation. If they say, no, that's not right, that's okay. That's just where they're at today. Yeah.
Okay. Are there any resources or websites that you would recommend that can be used to support the conversation?
Yeah, I have a bunch of them on my website, which is autismunderstanding.com.au, and I know you have lots of resources on your website, Positive Partnerships. So probably the book that I would recommend the most would be, it's called Making Sense of Asperger's, A Story for Children. And that one is really good because it uses that whole Apple and Android terminology. So it talks about computers. Computers having different operating systems. And so, Mac has OS and PCs have Windows. And so there's different operating systems. And then there's a standard operating system where people make sense of things in terms of emotions and lots of talking and wanting to be with lots of people all the time. And then there's this Asperger's operating system where people think in pictures and they might prefer to be with one person at a time or have some time by themselves, and they might get a bit overloaded with noise and those kinds of things. And that's just another operating system. And so it talks about the two different operating systems, and then it also has a thing about crashes. So sometimes when you're using your computer, you have too many windows open and you're clicking and nothing's happening, and you kind of got to restart the computer again. That can happen with people as well. Yeah. So sometimes you just kind of get overloaded and you need a bit of a time to calm down, and then you can go again. Yeah. So I think those kinds of ideas are really helpful. Yeah.
Would you like me to ask any other questions, or is there anything else that you'd like to add that we haven't covered that you think is important?
No, I think we've probably covered everything. Is there anything that you were thinking you wanted me to talk about?
I don't know. Should we do an example or something?
The one that sticks in my head is a young man who was 15, and his parents had known since he was 6 or 7 that he had autism, or Asperger's at the time. And then there was an incident at school, and somebody threw a ball at him. They were playing basketball at the time, but he felt like they were bullying him, and he screamed and ran away. And so his parents brought him in, and I'd never met them, and they said, we don't know how to tell him. Can you tell him? We'll wait outside. Which was a bit tricky. And I really encouraged them to come in, because I was like, it'll work so much better if we're all in together and we're all having this conversation together. And they were shaking. They were so frightened. And, and so anyway, I went in there with him and I asked him about what was happening. And he told me about what had happened at school. And I said, what do you think's going on? And he said, well, I think I have schizophrenia. So, and I said, what makes you think that? And he was really into movies, and he had been watching A Beautiful Mind. And so he had recognized some things that he did. And so he thought that he had a mental illness. And so he was a bit of an, analytical person. And so I ended up, because, he just wasn't sure when I said, I think it might be something else. And I talked about Asperger's, and he was like, maybe it is. And so we got out the DSM-5 and went through the criteria, because I knew that he'd already been doing research. So I had to convince him that my criteria was better than his, and so we actually kind of compared the criteria, and he looked at it and went, yeah, I think this Asperger's thing is a better explanation. And so then we got his parents to come in, and it was an amazing conversation, because I said, I'm so glad, you brought him in, because he thought he had schizophrenia. And they were just so shocked because they had no idea. He'd been keeping this diagnosis to himself. And so they had thought that by not telling him that, ignorance is bliss, but sometimes it isn't. And so he was really excited about this diagnosis of Asperger's. He's like, cool, who can we tell? And so we filled out this ASD student profile that is free on my website, and it's in iLanguage. So he was able to fill it in and say, these are the things that he does and these are the things that work for him. And he gave it to all of his teachers at school, which was really empowering for him, which was really lovely. So not only did he find out about his diagnosis, but then he told all his teachers about it. He was so excited. Wow. So that was really good. Yeah. So it could have gone badly, but it went really well. Yeah.
So do you think you could count up how many people you have discussed their diagnosis with? And of that percentage, what went really well and what didn't?
I guess I encourage most of my clients to have that conversation. So often we'll do it in the session, but otherwise I'll talk to them about how to have the conversation at home with their kids. And I'm just struggling to think of a time when it hasn't gone well, really. I think if you prepare for it and you do it in the right way, then there's not a lot of reasons why it would go wrong. Yeah. I think actually, no, there is one. I can tell you about one young man who he just didn't have a huge amount of insight into his own difficulties. So his parents understood that he was struggling with making friends. He was actually really good at making friends on the surface. So he felt like he had lots of friends, but they were more acquaintances than friends. And so he'd been coming to see me, and I'd been trying to work around this whole thing of the friendships and stuff. And one day he was like, why are you on my case? You keep saying all this stuff like I don't have friends. I've got friends. And I said, well, why do you think you're coming here? And he said, to play with your toys. And so I said, right, so what do you think I'm doing? And he's like, I don't know. You just keep asking all these random questions. And so I sort of had a chat with him, and and his mum and dad had been coming, and and they thought we were all on the same page, like we'd been through the diagnostic process, and they thought that he had a good handle on things, but actually he was not a client. He was coming and playing, and his mum and dad and I were talking, and he was blocking us out because he didn't need any of the strategies because he was fine. And so I guess that's where I said to them, look, I don't think it's, I don't want to take your money. If that's where he's at, if he's not distressed and he doesn't think that he's having any issues with friends, then why would he want to work on that? So, I was happy to support them because they were putting some strategies in place to help him. And I've seen them other times when other things have happened, but I haven't seen him again because he didn't see that there was any issue. So there was no need for him to really have that conversation. And I think maybe in the future, if, we certainly left the door open that, he was always welcome to come back, or, he can talk to his parents, obviously, about it. If at some point he works out that maybe his friends are not quite as friendly as he thought, then he can have that conversation again. But there was no point in making him feel like things were worse than he thinks they are. Yeah.
Okay, that's all the questions that I've got for you today.